Hello and welcome back to the podcast. It is always up to speed with Formula One. It is Friday, January 27th, 20. Welcome back to the world headquarters for Bad Dad Jokes and the Nancy Pelosi fan club. If you were listening last week, that one might actually make a little bit of sense because I still can't wrap my head around how we got wrapped up that, considering this is a nonpartisan podcast, but still. Anyways, my friend, how are you this evening? Happy almost weekend.
Happy almost February. We're a month into 2022. What the heck? And I keep saying we're about to celebrate the 2-year anniversary of COVID, but nobody is celebrating the 2-year anniversary of COVID. But that is rapidly upon us.
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah, that's true. I don't think that's any, anniversary. I can't imagine at any point in the future, hey, happy COVID anniversary. Yeah, it's not going to happen. But yeah, I mean, I'm ready to get to the weekend started here. It's been a crazy busy week, and with the weekends like literally in the headlights here, and this busy week rapidly disappearing into the rearview mirror, I'm happy to put my feet up for a couple of days. But hey, plenty of things to talk about this week. There's been quite a bit of news, quite a bit of things to talk about. Before we get into that, we had a couple of interesting little stories to talk about. First of all, wanted to give Andy Amendola a shout out at Red Racer Books. Go look him up on Twitter, give him a follow. We talked about him last week. He's going to be is the Kickstarter live for that? He's going to be doing this.
I think it's about to start, but follow him on Twitter at redracerbooks.com and you'll get all of the updates.
Yeah, that's awesome. Love that the concept that he sent us, and it's looking great. So give him a follow. And the next thing is that now that we've almost put January 2022 behind us, that means that we have car launches literally right around the corner. I mean, if the weekend's in full view, the car launches are just a little bit in front of us. You've got some dates here, some that have been added to the calendar, because I think last week we only had what 4, maybe 5 out of the 10 teams had committed to a launch date.
Yeah, so we had 4 last week. We've added a couple, and the good news is we're less than 2 weeks away from the very first reveal, and that date could come even sooner if Alfa Romeo, Red Bull, Haas, or Williams announce a date sooner than February 10th, which is the date that Aston Martin will be revealing their 2022 contender, followed once again by McLaren on February 11th, so we get teams back-to-back. AlphaTauri will be revealing their contender on February 14th, followed by Ferrari on the 17th. I feel like we're accustomed to Ferrari revealing at the back of the pack. Typically, like to keep us waiting a little bit, but they'll be right in the middle of the pack this year, followed by Mercedes on February 18th and Alpine on February 21st. And like I said, we've yet to hear from Alfa Romeo, Red Bull, Haas, or the Williams team. But 6 teams now, and the first launch less than 2 weeks away. Pretty cool.
Well, Ferrari's still salty that they got knocked out in our March Madness tournament last year when we rated the liveries for the 21
Mission
cars.
Winnow did that to them, my friend. Mission Winnow.
Yeah, that ugly green on that beautiful scarlet red really killed the look of that car for me. So, they got to step their game up. So fingers crossed.
Were we going to do that again this year? We should,
right?
With
the
new
we
2022 cars,
right? Yeah,
I totally agree.
We'll launch March Madness in February if we have to, because that's how committed we are.
And you know what I'll do as well is I'll set up a bracket. I'll figure out how to do this, but I'll set up a bracket so everybody listening at home can participate. And what we'll do is we'll do a bracket digitally, and then we'll share everyone's opinions from home. So we'll kind of announce the winner from our listeners, and then we'll also announce our favorites as well. So let us set something fun up. I think that'll be cool.
I think we could do like a Twitter poll, right? Kind of put 5 teams on one side, 5 on the other, and kind of put like Mercedes and Red Bull opposites. And well, we know what the Red Bull is going to look like.
Well,
it's
it's funny that you bring up Twitter brackets, because today I ran 4 brackets that are going to lead into one final bracket for the best fast food chicken sandwich. That is what I was up to today. While you were working your ass off, I was on Twitter posting polls to find out which chicken sandwich our listeners love the most. And so far, it looks like it's going to be not Popeyes, which disappointed me because that's my favorite now that we have them in Canada.
Well, it's the beta test for like the one that really counts. But, having said that, knowing what the best chicken sandwich is important to know. I mean, this is just
Absolutely.
this is what we do for our fellow F1 fans. So,
Absolutely. We're just
anyways,
out there grinding, baby.
there's always something new coming from us one way or another. A couple of other things. Sergio Perez turned 32. I mean, he seems like old, but not really. When I see that number, it seems like a big number. Then I look at my birth certificate, and shudder and or cringe and silent scream and all that stuff. Lance, yeah, better less said about that, the better. Lance Stroll, our fellow Canadian, hit a hole in one. Cue all the bad jokes here that Daddy hired a professional golfer to shoot a hole in one for Lance, and then he took the credits. Yeah, you know that comment's coming. And what was the last one? You had one more up there as well.
Lily Herman's engine failure is back. And
Yes.
it's funny. I was sitting downstairs at the dining room table working the other day. Of course, the office is under construction, the unending construction project. It might as well be a bridge in Montreal. But I'm sitting here and I could hear her screech a joyous screech because engine failure was back. We are still
Awesome.
working to hopefully get Lily on the show at some point in the near future. I think that could be a lot of fun. If you
Totally.
don't subscribe to the engine failure newsletter, slide us a DM. I'll flip you the link. It's really fun. And typically she pushes out some updated, fun Formula One content every
Totally.
Monday morning.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally get in on that. She does a great job. Okay, so let's go to the mailbag. You guys, I apologize. Mark, we got like spammed over like the last month. I don't know what's up with Gmail, but our inbox was full with like literally hundreds of garbage emails. I answered a couple of them over the last few days. So, apologies. I didn't get back to them. They were literally buried. I don't know. It's just,
By the way,
that's what
the,
you
the
get.
garbage, when he says garbage, he's not or speaking to listener emails, but a
No,
lot of actual spam, which
actual
is
spam that's
hiding,
like, yeah, yeah.
concealing the good stuff.
Exactly, and unfortunately, the garbage stuff was concealing all the good stuff. But
Yeah.
the one that came in just actually yesterday from Devin in Utah. This is a cool one, so I'm going to read it out. Hey guys, just hit my 1 year anniversary of listening. Keep it up. So this off season, to pass the time, I've been watching the race reviews, the 10 to 15 minute ones on the F1 TV app from each race since 2000 to give me a quote unquote modern race history lesson. I'm currently on 2014. The three biggest takeaways I have of the past 20 years. One, like other sports, the athletes complain more and more each year to the refs, in brackets, stewards in this case. Likewise, more and more each year, officials get more involved in deciding outcomes. That's an interesting observation. Two, drivers that complain the most have been guilty of the same thing that they complain about. I noticed this with Lewis Hamilton and Fernando Alonso. Both complain about things that they did all the time in the past. It's another interesting observation. And three, all dynasties end eventually. Father Time is undefeated. Great observation, great comment. That final run for Schumacher with Mercedes was difficult to watch, much like Sebastian Vettel, compared to their early greatness. Thoughts? Thanks for all you do. Devin R. in Utah. P.S. Planning a cruise to Alaska this summer with a stop in Victoria, BC, which isn't too far from you. Any recommendations for a 1 day stop? Do you want to talk about the recommendations, or should we shoot Devin an email? I mean, there's a lot in this email that's really juicy and fun to talk about.
Yeah, let's get it. So one, Victoria, nice town. It's where I went to university. It's a
Yeah.
great university slash college town. It's on the very peninsula, the southern peak of Vancouver Island, actually far south of the 49th parallel, which is kind of
Yep.
close, kind of interesting. Like I think it's actually almost closer to Seattle than maybe it is even
Well, they got the
us here
ferry that
in.
goes right from the inner harbor to Seattle. I
Yeah,
mean, it comes like what, twice a day or something like that. I think it
yeah,
goes
yeah,
in the morning,
totally.
comes
It's
back in the afternoon. Yeah.
definitely connected to the US, and Victoria is known because it has a distinctive British feel, and it
Mm.
kind of plays that up in its tourism and its marketing. But yeah, it's a beautiful little tourist town. It's a beautiful little college town. Very, very cool. Definitely a different feel than other big cities in the country. But yeah,
Yeah.
let's get into the F1 stuff because I think he had some really pronounced observations and I think he articulated them really well. Eager to hear your thoughts.
So the first one, like, is point number one. And Devin, I'll send you an email. We got some great tips here that this will rapidly turn into like an episode of Rick Steves Europe or something. But Mark and Mark's Southern Vancouver Island travel tips. Anyways, the first item that Devin mentioned, like, when he says that athletes complain more and more each year to the referees, over the past 20 years, I thought that was a really interesting comment, and I really hadn't picked up on that as right off the top of my head. I guess that's something that just over the passage of time that maybe I've just grown accustomed to. But when you go back and kind of look at it in that context. And I'd be interested to go back and start doing the same thing that Devin's been doing and watch these condensed race reviews and see. I mean, of course, they take all the good stuff, the interesting stuff, and pack it into that 10 or 15 minutes. But yeah, I think that is very much a very astute observation. What about you, Mark? Do you agree or disagree with that?
Yeah, I think Father Time can be kind on these type of things, and I think we earlier this season talked to Tim Haraney, and I think one of the and this was before Abu Dhabi, so hold your scolding of Mr. Mark Hamilton, but we had asked him, "Hey, look, you know what?" Oh, I think it was actually in one of the Q&A sessions we did on Spaces, so it wasn't a podcast. I apologize, but we had specifically asked him that question, which is, "Hey, look, when we look back and we reflect back on 2021, are we going to remember the stewarding snafus? Are we going to remember the controversies?" Now,
Yeah.
incidentally, because of what happened in the final race, absolutely. I don't think anyone's going to forget about that. But was this year any different than any year we've seen before in terms of team principles, campaigning with the race director, and openly campaigning stewards in the media, like all that kind of stuff. And Tim had made a great point that this year wasn't distinctly different than any prior year in terms of team principal conduct, driver conduct, um, whatever the case may be. And that I think with time, sometimes those elements of a championship kind of fade with time and they tend to melt away. And we remember the on track battles and we remember the records that are broken and things like that. I don't know that it's really any different now than it has been before. I think what is distinctly different is that fans can engage in the sport in a way they haven't been able to in previous generations with social media. So,
Mhm.
oftentimes, when there is an altercation on the radio or a confrontation in the paddock, it's amplified and repeated over and over again. And I think 20 years ago, Formula One, who has total and complete control over the broadcast of its races, was very, very good at deciding what viewers at home would consume. So we may not even know about, so it may have been like this, but we just may not have known. We may not have been as aware of what the paddock battles were like between the team principals and the drivers. We may not have known
Mhm.
the amount of animosity that there may have been between team principals and race directors. I think there was also a tremendous amount of respect for Charlie Whiting during his time as well. And I think that that was well established within the paddock and within the world of at the FIA. But I don't know that it's any different. I just think we have a better window into what's happening now than we have before.
Well, I think that's true. Like the amount of information that we have access to, just in not just Formula One, but life in general. I mean, we can get anything we want basically at the click of a button or a tap of a screen, right? But I think what made this year a little bit different is the fact that the stakes were much higher and the incidents that really made the
Yeah, that's a
headlines this
great
year
point.
were that much bigger. Silverstone, Monza, and obviously Abu Dhabi,
And
Saudi
Spa, and
Arabia,
Spa.
and Spa. There was a number of flashpoints that were also the flames were fanned by certain parties on certain sides that really, I think, amplified it. I think that was a great word
That
that you picked, that really kind of blew things up, at certain points throughout the year. But in general, certainly across other sports, I think there's definitely a good call for that players in general are just more vocal. They'll get up in the ref's face and
yeah.
things like that. So that was definitely a good
But
observation. So sorry, go ahead.
they're all I was just gonna say they're all use the media, right? Like 20
Yes.
years ago, I don't think athletes in any sport were as effective at driving a particular narrative or message through the media as they are
Mhm.
today. They know how to leverage an interview. They know how to
Oh,
leverage a
definitely.
soundbite. They know when to drop certain comments. And I think
Mhm,
20 years ago, maybe they just weren't as astute enough themselves to do this.
mhm.
Maybe the media was different, but I think they have teams behind them that can help drive a message, whether it's about officiating, whether it's about a contract negotiation, anything
Sure.
like that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great observation as well. Point number 2, drivers that complain the most have been guilty of the same thing they complain about. I noticed this with Lewis and Fernando Alonso, both complaining about things that they did all the time in the past. So your thoughts on that one? Fernando, of
Sorry.
course, has been very vocal at times. I mean, and still even today, maybe he's mellowed a little bit because I think maybe this year his return to Formula One with Alpine and maybe just where they were on the grid and the season that they had, and maybe finally with age has maybe mellowed him a little bit, and realizing that maybe making these incendiary comments over the race radio is maybe not the best way to build relationships with your teammates or your engineer or other people within the team. Because I mean, you kind of go back to like second era of Fernando at McLaren, and some of the things that he said, especially about Honda, were very, very disparaging. But not just about inter-team stuff, but also things that happen on the track. So that was an interesting one, and that's a comment that my wife has often made about Lewis, saying that, well, why is he complaining about that? Because he just did the same thing himself. And I'm generalizing and parsing here a little bit.
Sir,
You
was
don't
there
want
a
to take this
question in
one
there
up.
somewhere for me?
Yeah. You were I was
No,
hoping you were going
I'm
to take this
joking.
one
I'm
up. Now there's
joking.
a
No,
couple
I
like
think
seconds of dead air.
I think we see this a lot in life, right? Which
Sure.
is people that commit certain acts or behave in a certain way tend to project that on other people. And I think for sure Alonso and I think Hamilton have been guilty of that, especially I would say era one Hamilton, that McLaren era Hamilton. I think he evolved as a driver and as a person after he made the transition to Mercedes and he was in a more stable environment. But Alonso too, especially early in his career, Ferrari Alonso, McLaren Alonso, Renault Alonso, and of course, and I'm glad you brought that up, but I still think of that entire second era McLaren experience as being a total disaster. It was bad for him, it was bad for McLaren, it was bad for the
Mhm.
sport. And dude, honestly, even now, I didn't believe for a second he would ever get another ride with a Formula One team. After the way he trashed Honda and McLaren, I couldn't
Yeah.
believe it. And then it kind of made sense that, look, if anyone's going to do it, it's probably going to be Renault slash Alpine because they have linkage with him and they desperately needed a marketable star. But he has
And they're
evolved as a
totally
person.
terribly run to begin with. So what, you know?
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. But it ultimately turned out to be a smart move because he's very much evolved as a person, and maybe that was the
Mhm.
conversation they had with him when they were putting ink to paper and signing to that contract, which was, hey, there are some. We're going to govern your behaviors on and off the track, and we expect certain things. And the way you behaved with McLaren isn't going to be appropriate this time around.
So for those of you that maybe aren't familiar with the 2015 era Fernando at McLaren, let's just sum it up in this short um, thought. How not to Formula One. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. 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 I love it.
Okay, so the third and final point, all dynasties and eventually top Father Time is undefeated. That final run for Schumacher with Mercedes was difficult to watch, much like Sebastian Vettel compared to their early greatness. And yeah, I mean, there's not really a lot that I can add to that. I mean, when you go back and you watch how Schumacher broke into the sport, how he really flipped Formula One on its head back in 92 at Spa, where he literally came out of nowhere and got this drive with Jordan and just was astonishing. And then, getting snapped up and going to Benetton and that real quick rise to the pinnacle of Formula
Right.
One, and then following it up with world championships in 95 and 96, and then going over to Ferrari. Couple of lean years there, which was, in hindsight, to be expected with a team that had lost their way and was in the middle of a rebuild. Obviously, if you go back and look at the history books, they did get it right, and they got it really, really right. I mean, they rattled off a number of championships in succession, pulling a Mercedes before Mercedes started doing it back in 2014, and then retiring and then coming back more as I think doing Mercedes a solid and helping them get that project off the ground. But I mean, that post first retirement Schumacher, like Devin said, was just painful or difficult to watch compared to Schumacher at his peak.
I don't want to be insensitive with this comparison, but you're right.
Mhm.
For all those folks that don't enjoy watching a dynasty in sport, and for some reason, I actually do really enjoy dynasties, um, even despite the fact that typically my teams aren't at the forefront of the dynasty movement. But dynasties, in a sense, are like, and this sounds terrible, and I realize how insensitive it is before I say it, but it's like a pandemic, right? Which is
Mhm.
ultimately all pandemics end. And I like his point that all
Man, you're just so
dynasties
gloomy with the pandemic stuff this week, dude. Sorry, go
Oh
on,
man,
continue, please.
I'm ready to be done with it. They all come to an end, and I think the Mercedes one eventually will. maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but eventually it will come to an end. And it'll come to an
Mhm.
end because eventually they'll make some poor decisions around aero or the development maybe of their next generation power unit, or preferably another team just gets it really right and they capture
Mhm.
lightning in a bottle. But
Teach
he's
them their
right.
own
I
game.
do like that point. Like, you look at recent dynasties in major professional sports in North America, the Bulls had a great 3-year run and then they broke apart partially for 2 years and then they brought it back together. And then they were in the darkness for a very long time. And the Yankees were great in the late 90s. And then
Mhm.
they cooled off for a few years and they won a title in '09. And, we've seen the Golden State Warriors on this pronounced, I don't even know. Can we call them a dynasty yet? 3 titles? Maybe they're getting close. But again, the point being that all dynasties come to an end. And we saw that with New England. I think you could argue that New England was absolutely a dynasty, even though they spread their
Mhm.
championships out over the better part of 2 decades. But you see Tom Brady leave and they maybe don't crater, but they cool off quite a bit. The point being that all dynasties end. So people will scream and kick and complain when there is a dynasty in full force, but eventually they always end.
Yeah, that's true, and I mean that it's interesting too the way that you make that comparison with the the Patriots sort of you know heyday and the amount of championships that they rattled off with him as their leader and their quarterback for literally like what 25 decades. And
Yeah.
then I mean all things like you say, all good things have to come to an end. And while they do have some good players still in that team, they still made the playoffs. Let's not forget. I mean, they didn't get as far and win it as obviously their fans would want to. But sports is cyclical. But when you go back and maybe look at some of these great names or great teams over the years, and especially where you see these ones, and I think the Schumacher one is a great case study, if you will, where you had this guy that basically was larger than life. He was this Formula One legend. He retires arguably at his pinnacle, right? So I mean, he's kind of left the sport with that a bit of mystique, and then, well, is he walking away too soon? Which I think if you're at that spot, and I kind of have that feeling a little bit with Lewis. And I mean, I not that I say he should retire right now, but I mean, it's like you kind of always want to leave that what if question, right? It's knowing when to walk away from the sport when the time is right before you get over that hump on that sort of bell-shaped curve, right? Because once you start to cool off and age starts to catch up with you, or maybe you're still driving good, but you move on to maybe a less competitive team. Maybe the team you had all the success with wants to move on because you've become too expensive. You can't come to a new deal or whatever it is that the mystique kind of goes. And for me, I try to forget about that second era of Schumacher, because it really wasn't the same driver as he was prior, right?
We've said this so many times, and we're probably not the only one to draw this comparison, but it was very much the Washington Wizards, Michael Jordan of Formula One when he came back to Mercedes. And,
Sure.
maybe we shouldn't discount what he maybe contributed to that team and helping to develop the car. But then again, the car that ultimately launched Mercedes into superstardom, into the stratosphere in terms of performance, was very different than the one he was driving. And he
Hmm.
ultimately would never have had an opportunity to drive a car with one of the current generations of power units. Now, I know we're up against a break, but maybe just one more question for you, just to kind of
Sure.
close this off. But I'm a big fan of dynasties, and I love
Mhm.
dynasties because I love to watch people attack them, and then finally break through. I find that really satisfying. You're a big sports guy. You follow team sports just like me. Do you prefer in a perfect world to see a different champion every single year, or do you like to see runs of sustained greatness and then finally somebody breaking through and taking that trophy away?
Well, as somebody that's a lifelong Manchester United fan, this is probably an interesting question to ask, because when I started following United back, the first thing I ever remember them winning was the FA Cup back in '85, when I was just a kid. And then I think they won, I guess, what they called the European Cup Winners' Cup in the early '90s, and then the Premier League came online. What was it, 1992? And then, I mean, they basically
Yeah.
owned it for a decade and a half with Sir Alex Ferguson as the manager and some of the great names that they had there. And then Sir Alex retiring now, what, in 2012, 2013, or whatever it was. And they've really been kind of lost in the wilderness ever since. I mean, there's been a rotating door of managers in and out of United, at Old Trafford, and they just haven't been able to find that magic again. I mean, so some were better obviously than others, but it was interesting. I mean, I enjoyed it at the time being a fan, but now being a fan and that success is gone, it's kind of painful, and it's difficult. I mean, you still support and you still cheer for your team, but then when it comes to like watching other teams, it's yeah, it's difficult because being a United fan, I'm not happy to say, well, United's not winning, but hey, across town, City's been pretty good and they've won a bunch of championships and FA Cups and all the like. They're arguably the biggest rivals, so no, I wouldn't be happy with that. But I guess the context comes down to it. Which sport is it? Is it a sport maybe I'm a little bit less invested in? Because when it comes to like NFL, I'm a big NFL guy, and my 49ers are doing pretty good this year. I mean, off to the sorry, NFC championship game this weekend. And so, yeah, I mean, I want to see them do good, but at the same time, I have a lot of respect for what they did in New England over all those years as well. So, for me, it's a little bit different. I kind of pick and choose which ones I kind of like to see, and nothing against Mercedes, but I think that their time at the top is due to end, and it would be nice to see somebody beat them on a regular basis. And I think that's part of the fun of what we're going to see going into this year, is that everything is up for grabs. And the big question is did Mercedes did they get it right for 2022? And if so, did somebody else get it much more righter than Mercedes? I mean, wonderful English there, but you know what I mean, right? Did they design and build a good car, but did somebody outsmart them and build a better one? And are they going to be this new shining light and the benchmark going into this new era of Formula One, where Mercedes, obviously, without a doubt, is the undisputed champion and king of this 2014 to 2021 era of Formula One? No doubt about it there. Again, silence on your behalf. So
I'm
I
waiting for you to go to commercial break.
I go. I was I was
I'm
kind of like
teasing.
left it out there. I was waiting for this either a comment or something that yeah, no, I like it, or no, I'm gonna add this. But
No,
hey.
I think you make some really great points, and obviously I'm a fan of Mercedes because of the
Mhm.
connection to Lewis. But there have been times during this run where I'm like, yeah, this felt great, this was fun, but there's this nagging sense of guilt because you know what you're watching isn't necessarily good for the well-being
Mm,
of the sport. And
sure.
it's not quite so much. It's not quite like that when you talk about professional team sports, but I think as big and rich as Formula One is, it's also incredibly fragile. You could have an OEM, you could have an engine supplier pull out of the sport at a moment's notice. And we saw that with Honda. That was a shock. And we've seen Honda leave before, and we've seen
Mhm.
big teams come in. And then we see teams like Toyota and BMW that are incredibly well heeled companies back out of the sport. So I think Formula One's different than professional team sports in North America because you know what? The Milwaukee Bucks or the Milwaukee Brewers are going to survive a sustained period of brilliance from the Golden State Warriors and the New York Yankees. But in Formula One, if you have a team like Mercedes that runs off 10 straight constructors championship, you could pre salary cap, I guess not salary cap, but pre-cost cap, you could see teams dropping
Mhm.
off, and you could see other OEMs that just say, "What's the point? We're not getting anything out of this. We're in this for the marketing exposure. We're in this because we want to be able to hang banners in our dealerships. We can't sustain this." So I think for me, I love it in team sports, and as much as I've enjoyed Lewis's run, there's always this nagging sense of guilt, knowing that what I was watching wasn't good for F1, and everything that we're going to see starting, I guess, last year, but mostly this year with the new regs and the cost cap is
Mhm.
designed to make sure that we don't see another Mercedes because the sport doesn't want another Mercedes.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think that's like you say, a big difference between Formula One and say the NFL. The NFL has X number of teams. Maybe they add a couple of here, but I mean, rarely do you see teams contract in the big four North American leagues, right? And I mean,
Totally.
they tend to move them rather than contract, and take a
Totally.
take that franchise away. I mean, there are so I mean, look at the two teams we have in LA now, the Rams and the Chargers. I mean, they've come from obviously different places, and now you've got two teams in LA when there was no NFL team in LA for the longest of time, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the LA. I mean, you could argue the LA Rams have just come back home after an extended,
Yeah.
stay somewhere else. But
Vacation in Port St. Louis.
yeah, nothing
Although
against St.
St.
Louis, but
Louis hit I was just going to say, I don't know if you saw this, but St. Louis won a bit of a lottery in their lawsuit with the NFL. They were
oh,
awarded almost $800 million as a byproduct of the relocation of that team. So ultimately, they relocated because they couldn't. Stan Kroenke was going to move that team anyways, but ultimately, they argued that they couldn't get a good enough stadium deal. But ultimately, the city and the NFL ended up in
mhm.
court, and in damages, St. Louis won $790 million US from the NFL.
There you go. They're going to take that 8 million or $800 million and roll it into like relocating another NFL team and bring it
Exactly,
back to
exactly.
St.
By the way,
Louis.
we are
But
so far off topic. We should really have a commercial break and get to the news.
yeah, we should. Anyways, that's a great, not so subtle segue. Don't go away. We'll be back in just a moment. All right. Well, welcome back to the show. And yes, I promise. Well, promise. I'm going to try and do my best to keep this thing on track. But yeah, there's a lot of news to talk about. First one we should get to is this one, and I can understand why people are justifiably a little bit upset. But this first preseason test or shakedown at Barcelona that's going to go ahead in a couple of weeks is going to happen behind closed doors. There's going to be no TV coverage. There's going to be no fans in the stands, and this is going to happen on 23 to 25th of February. So only about 3.5 weeks from now. And obviously, all eyes are on Formula One. Everybody is tuned in and dialed in, wanting to see these car launches that are coming up in the next couple of weeks. I mean, the real preseason test starts in Bahrain on March 10th. That goes for 2 or 3 days, and that's just a week ahead of the season opener in Bahrain on March 18th. So it's what Formula One is saying on their website. It's a low key pre testing track session, and allowing all the teams to shake down their all for new 2022 cars for the first time in the same place. So is this kind of a Formula One way of explaining? We want to see if we got it right, and if we got it wrong, we don't want anybody in there to see what we we messed it all up. Now that the genie's out of the bottle, so to speak.
Definitely. And there was absolutely some furor on F1 Twitter a couple of days ago when this story was released because we were all expecting, and we were
Mhm.
expecting it because that had been what was communicated to us, that this was going to be a formal testing session. You could buy tickets, they would be posting lap times throughout the course of the day. It would be broadcast live. And I think ultimately the conclusion that F1, the FIA, and the teams came to is, hey, you're asking us to put cars on the track that have never finished a lap. We have no idea what this is going to look like. Like, this is a real shakedown. We just need to make sure that these things can complete a lap, that the DRS systems work, that those
Sure.
18-inch wheels aren't going to come flying off in the first corner. So I think the fans and the community is disappointed because we were excited to see some real winter testing and start to see some lap times pull in. I think we were expecting to see some live broadcasts, and there will be packaged up TV content that will be made available on the F1 TV Pro app. So we'll be able to get kind of daily summaries of what's happened and what we're seeing, and maybe some highlights from some of the top lap times. But it's not necessarily what people were expecting. And I was certainly excited. I'm disappointed, but I get from a business perspective, this makes sense that if I'm one of these teams and I just spent the better part of 2 years putting together this car and I've never had the opportunity to run it on a track, I probably don't want every camera in the world on my car as I do it.
Mhm.
Just like, and one of our listeners made a great comp that, look, you know what? A new team signs a free agent in the offseason. They probably don't want the media in the doctor's office when they're doing the physical before they finalize that contract. Like, these teams want a little bit of breathing room. So we'll get some daily summaries on the F1 TV Pro app, and we'll see some highlights and things like that. But it isn't a real winter testing session. It's 3 days of shakedown because these teams are bringing entirely new cars to the grid this season.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I find it personally a little bit disappointing, but I understand their reasons for doing it. And I guess from Formula One's point of view, or maybe more specifically, Michael Massey was probably relieved that for at least a couple of days that the rage was directed elsewhere. Maybe
Yeah,
at
that's a
least a
great
little bit
point. I never thought
dialed
about
down.
that.
Okay, now the next one, just to sort of sticking with the theme of tracks, there's a list that has come out of the current contracts in Formula One, who's paying what for hosting fees, when the contract ends, and any status updates or comments or anything like that. Now, it's interesting when you look at some of the hosting fees. I'm surprised relatively how low they are for the European tracks compared to how high they are for the Middle Eastern tracks. So you look on the hosting fee on the high side, we have Bahrain, which is 45 million. Saudi is 55 million. Then you go to the land of the one percenters, Monte Carlo. Their hosting fee $15 million, so 15 million US. Obviously, that's on the low side. That's on the very very low end of things. And then a lot of the other European tracks, Imola is 20 million, Spain 25, France 22, Great Britain 25. Hungary is a bit of an outlier there. Theirs is 40 million. They've got a contract that runs to 2027. Canada 30 million. Where's the USA? So Austin, they're paying 25 million. Same for Brazil. And then again, well, on the high side again, Abu Dhabi 40, China 50, and Qatar 55 million. I'm just surprised that there's a real difference in some of those race hosting fees. And I can't help but think that some of these ones, like the European venues, might be grandfathered in just because they've been on the calendar for so long. But then if you look at Mexico City, their hosting fee is only 25 million, and they're a relative newcomer. I mean, compared to some of the other, I mean, China's been around a lot longer than Mexico in recent times, at any rate.
Yeah, this is the kind of thing that I get really excited about when it comes to Formula One. The business side excites
Mhm.
me much more than what happens on the track. So I pay very close attention to this kind of news. And for those of you that are new to F1 or haven't listened to us before, race sanctioning fees, which is exactly what Mr. Daly was just speaking to, represent about a third of all of the revenue that Liberty earns. So Liberty is the commercial rights holder for Formula One. They extract revenue from a number of places. One
Mhm.
is sanctioning fees. So they don't actually host the races themselves. They sell the rights on to a local organizer in individual countries to host the race. And they also earn revenues through major sponsorship and then through TV and streaming money. But about a third of their total income comes from race sanctioning fees. Now, I think what this reflects, and I would encourage people to check it out, is if you talk about places like Australia, Italy, so Monza and Imola, Spain, you talk about Canada, France, Austria, Great Britain, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, which I just said, Japan. These are more traditional. These are more traditional events, and in those countries, you have a private contractor that is working with F1 to host a race. And ultimately, at the end of the day, they need to break even. And the amounts that they pay is what they can afford to pay for an event to break even. When you look at some of
Mhm.
these countries, and you made a great call out about the tracks in the Middle East, like if you're talking about Jeddah and you're talking about the UAE and you're talking about Qatar and Bahrain, well, these tracks and these events are largely, and I mean this really, really, really politely, they're very much marketing exercises for the countries in which they're hosted. I'll be very honest. I don't think most of our listeners would have any idea what or where Bahrain was if not for the fact that it hosted an F1 event. So
True.
these events are designed as marketing exercises as much as they are for anything else. And you look at Qatar last year, like that was held at a track that seats 10,000 people at a $55 million sanctioning fee. They were never going to break even, nor do they expect to break even, because what they want to be able to do is put their state and their country onto the radar of people globally, because a lot of people didn't know where Abu Dhabi was prior to 2009.
Mhm.
Certainly no one knew where Bahrain was. Few people knew where Qatar was until a couple of years ago. And of course, Qatar is going to explode into the public conscience as of the World Cup this fall. But these are really
Exactly.
designed as marketing exercises so they can afford to spend this amount of money on sanctioning fees. Where I'll be very honest, if you are the race organizer at Silverstone, you cannot afford to lose any money. And those negotiations between the race organizers in Silverstone and
Mhm.
Liberty, they grind and they grind and they grind. They fall apart and they grind because And I'll be very clear here, Formula One is very, very, very aggressive with the way it extracts revenue. So, you know what, if you sign up to host an event with Formula One, like, okay, you know what, let's use here an example like Canada. Well, Canada's going to pay 30 million. So the race organizer in Canada is Bell Telecommunications. They spent $30 million. So they're going to be able to cash in on ticket revenue. They're going to be able to cash in on food and drink. But the merchandising at the track, well, that's all done and supplied by F1, and F1 keeps all of the merchandising revenue. So there's no revenue for them there. All
Mhm.
of the hospitality and the luxury seating, the Paddock Club, VIP Club, well, that's all done and coordinated through Liberty. So even if you host one of these events, there's very few opportunities for you to extract revenue out of it. So when you talk about some of these countries like Spain,
Mhm.
US, Italy, it's very difficult for them to break even. So even when you talk about Austin, there's 120,000 people pouring in on the Sunday. Well, you know what? You can earn off of the ticket revenue and you can earn off of food and drink, but you're earning nothing off of the merch. You're earning nothing off the Paddock Club. You're nothing
Sure.
earning nothing off of the VIP Club. It's tough. So I think we just need to draw that distinction that hey, some countries can pay those sanctioning fees because it's a really good marketing opportunity, but for
Mhm.
other places like Austin and Canada and Silverstone, they don't have that same luxury because it's being hosted by a private contractor that needs to break even.
And let's not forget also when it comes to Bell Telecommunications, they also own TSN, which broadcasts, guess
Yeah,
what? The official Formula One television feed. So there you go. All
absolutely.
right, cool. Let's move on to the next one, and this is going to be one that's obviously going to kick up, some reaction here. So apparently, FIA is planning new race management structure, their exact wording, in the wake of the big controversy, understatement, after the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. And I mean, we don't really know what's going to happen. This is a story that came via Andrew Benson at the BBC, and he's saying he's being rightfully a little bit kind of vague on it, but he was saying that sources have told the BBC that the FIA's plans are to introduce some kind of series of safeguards that will leave the race director freer to make decisions in a calmer environment. So, the thing is, we will see what that is actually going to entail, how that's going to be structured. That's kind of interesting. I mean, I think the big question on everybody's mind is, will Michael Massey, who was the race director, who was the guy that was in the booth, so to speak, that made that controversial call, that gave set up that whole last couple of laps at Abu Dhabi, that ultimately gave the Max Verstappen the opportunity to pass Lewis Hamilton and then ultimately win the race and the championship. And of course, there's been so many people that have been not only crying for change, but to want to see Michael Massey given, a massive atomic wedgie and then, get fired and sent home in shame and all these sorts of things, or at least threatened with the red hot poker, right?
Definitely.
But that's the big question: is will Massey keep his job? I mean, Martin Brundle, Sky Sports commentator and also former Formula One driver, was saying, what it was last week, I think it was saying that be careful what you wish for. That if Massey gets sacked, is there anybody that will be able to step up and take that job? Excuse me, because I mean, he more or less studied under Charlie Whiting, did he not?
Definitely.
Yeah.
This is one, and I got to give kudos to Andrew Benson because I think he's been one of the more mainline reporters that have continued to dig at this story. And he writes here, and I quote, there's widespread acceptance across the sport that race director Michael Massey failed to follow the rules correctly during a late safety car period in the title deciding race. I think what we're probably going to see here, and I would be shocked if Michael Massey was fired, I would be shocked. But I think what Andrew's writing here
Me too.
or inferring is there will be a subtle acknowledgement from the FIA that what happened wasn't correct, but it wasn't necessarily at the fault of a single individual, but rather there was a single individual who was significantly overworked, who had a direct line of communication to team principals that shouldn't have
Mhm.
existed. And I think their acknowledgement and their report is going to come out exactly as Andrew Benson describes here with a new race management structure. So when we talk about race management, we're talking about the day of the Grand Prix, the team that is managing what's happening on the track. So you're talking about the stewarding, the race director, who's managing the safety car. And I think what they're probably going to see, or what we're all going to probably see, is a much richer structure that
Mhm.
isolates that's ultimately going to isolate the race director from direct lines of communications from the teams, which we've heard is probably going to happen anyways, but that we're going to have a richer structure that helps delegate race officiating duties in a more meaningful way. So
Mhm.
kudos to Andrew Benson for continuing to dig on this. I would be shocked if Michael Massey was fired, and I know a lot of people listening at home would
Same.
be
Yeah.
disappointed, but I simply don't see the FIA doing that at this stage. I think if it was going to happen, it would already have happened, but I think they will, in a subtle way, acknowledge that ideally what happened in Abu Dhabi wouldn't have happened, and to ensure it doesn't happen again, they're going to put in a bigger, richer race management structure.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the thing is that you put somebody in that position, and left him with a very very difficult decision to make, right? And
Yeah.
I think that for me, like I said, right from the very beginning, is that regardless if you're cheering for Max or you're cheering for Lewis, that on some level, regardless of your allegiance, that you have to be concerned about this whole situation, that regardless if your driver won or lost, I mean, you should be able to put that aside. I mean, Lewis fans are understandably upset, but like I said, I think a couple of weeks ago, that even if you're Max Verstappen fan, you're ecstatic that your boy won the world championship, you have to be at least on some level concerned at at the situation that led to Max's victory in Abu Dhabi, because theoretically it could happen again. And imagine if the shoe is on the other foot. Imagine how cheated you feel for your driver. And then maybe you can understand the upset and the rage that Lewis's fans are having. So I mean, I think justifiably that he's worthy of some criticism. Whether or not that goes as far to that he should be fired from his job, I'm not really there yet. I think that fundamentally, like foundationally, that the FIA and Formula One need to make changes. And obviously, I think that if he does stay in that role, that he has to be under a bit of a microscope, pardon me, at the
Yeah.
moving on, and to ensure that these things don't happen again. I mean, it was a very unique situation. I mean, we all talk about 2016 and that race between Nico and Lewis going down to that last lap and everything, or that last race as well. But I mean, that championship between Lewis and Nico was far different than it was between Max and Lewis, because that was an inter-team battle. They were still going to win a constructors and a drivers championship. It was just like which driver was going to win, where there was this crescendo, this big wave that had kind of been building up all year between Red Bull and Max and Lewis and Mercedes, and it really peaked at Abu Dhabi. So the circumstances were a lot different, the same but different.
Con- Totally. And concludes Andrew Benson before we move on to the next story, because I think this is interesting. Sources have told BBC Sport that the FIA's plans are to introduce a series of safeguards that will leave the race director freer to make decisions in a calmer environment. Many insiders admit that Massey made a
Hmm.
series of operational errors in the closing laps at Yas Marina that were contrary to the rules and accepted protocols, and there
Sure.
remain serious questions about him in his future role. At the same time, it has been accepted that the Australian was left exposed,
Hmm.
isolated, and under too much pressure in the final laps of the race. A support structure is being planned for the race director, insiders say. This is likely to include a barrier between that role and the teams to avoid the direct lobbying to which Massey was subjected from the team bosses of both Mercedes and Red Bull in Abu Dhabi, and
Hmm.
revisions to the operations of the stewards, who are independent of the race director and decide on penalties for breaches of the rules, are also being considered.
Well, they got to look at everything. Let's put it that way.
Yeah,
So obviously,
I
this is going to
agree.
be a story that we're going to be watching closely, as are all of you, moving forward. Anyways, let's take another quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about our next favorite subject, and that is sprint races. So keep your hands on the steering wheel. We'll be back in just a moment. Okay, welcome back. And there are apparently, or there is some talk that perhaps they might have to ditch some of these sprint races in 2022. And honestly, rewind a year to this time in 2021, I think we were both really excited, perhaps a little bit too excited, which I guess is kind of the way that you and I both are. We were really looking forward to seeing how these sprint races were going to work, and how they were going to add a spectacle to the Formula One weekend. But we've both really cooled on this, and to be quite honest, if they decide that they have to abandon races or sprint races in 2022, for me, I'm honestly not that. I wouldn't be disappointed, Mark.
Yeah, it's crazy that we went from trialing it at 3 events last year to possibly as many as 6 sprint races this year, and
Yeah.
ultimately, what it's gonna come down to is the fact that there's a disagreement amongst the teams about how much additional money should be added to the cost cap to account for the fact that there could be damage and additional wear and tear from not 3, but 6 sprint races, and I think the biggest concern here is that while some teams are open to the concept of adding to the cost cap, and 2 teams are heavily lobbying to add as much as $5 million to the cost cap, most teams in the sport are absolutely not receptive to the idea of increasing the cost cap because they lobbied for years to get one. And it's probably no surprise, and we can speak to this a little bit now, but the 2 teams that it's been revealed are lobbying heavily to add an additional $5 million to the now $140 million cost cap are none other than, drumroll, Red Bull and Mercedes. Now, I
Mhm.
loved this quote from Zach Brown, who has been a huge advocate of, hey, let's do the sprint race, but we can't be adding incremental millions of dollars to the cost cap because that's really only going to benefit a few teams. But he had this really great stinging quote from a couple of weeks ago where he said, some teams still look for excuses to raise the cost cap and win world championships with checkbooks, he wrote in a preseason column on the McLaren website. The ongoing lobbying by certain teams to increase the cost cap for sprint race damage is a continuing example. This Saturday sprint race initiative by Formula One has added new viewers and raised the profile of the sport to expand its global fan base. However, these teams, who we now know are Mercedes and Red Bull, continue to demand a raise to the cost cap by an inordinate amount of money, despite the clear evidence that little damage was incurred during these races last year in a thinly veiled attempt to protect from their competitive advantage being eroded. So I love that Zach Brown here is
Yeah.
throwing some daggers at 2 very obvious targets.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, I'm an unabashed Zach Brown fanboy,
Yeah, me
and
too.
it's
Me
for
too.
stuff like that. And I just love that, that he's not pulling any punches, and he's not keeping quiet on this, and he's not really. I mean, he didn't obviously come out and name the guilty parties, but you can read between the
It's
lines
pretty
there. It's
clear.
pretty
Yeah.
obvious who he's talking about, right? And one of
Yeah.
those cars is silver, the other one is green with red and yellow on it. Or sorry, green, blue, pardon me.
I was going to
Uh,
say,
yeah, I was just like, yeah, no, pardon me. It's late. It's already 10 o'clock, and this coffee I got my mug is decaf. So, life lesson there. But I mean, great and good on for Zach, stepping up
right.
and saying this. I mean, it's interesting though that perhaps that the sprint races, might not go ahead just because from a cost point of view, and that's where the debate is, rather than maybe a sporting point of view, where that's where my issue is with it. It's just like, how can they make it a little bit more exciting? But I mean, there is no doubt that there were more eyes on Formula One, that there were more eyes on these events over the weekend, because the one thing that I thought was kind of cool was on a Friday being able to go fire up the F1 TV Pro app, pardon me, excuse me, I was going to hiccup, and then actually being able to follow what was happening on the Friday with like the qualifying for the sprint race. You got the sprint race on the Saturday, and then the big event, the main event on Sunday afternoon or Sunday morning, whatever it is. And so from that point of view, it was fun. It was just that you could kind of tell that once the race kind of settled down, that it kind of lost a little bit of the excitement, and drivers weren't going to risk too much. But I still think, and I guess that kind of goes back to the discussion that we've had before, that there is this untapped potential with the sprint races.
Yeah.
I just don't know exactly how to the mechanics of it to make it a little bit more, to just to tap into it and really extract from it what I think that they're really hoping to get.
You just hit on the exact thing that F1 is trying to tap into though, which is Friday interest. Like, let's be very honest. It's very rare that I'm tuning into free practice 1 and free practice 2 live,
Oh,
if
same.
ever.
Same.
You
Yeah.
know what I mean? But I'm definitely tuning into qualifying on a Friday afternoon when I should be working. So all of a sudden, F1 has my eyeballs on the Friday, the Saturday, and the Sunday. And while I'm still not convinced that the current format is correct, I think you and I have talked about this ad nauseum. To
Mhm.
me, qualifying should set the grid for the sprint race and for the Grand Prix. That the sprint race, it's not even a sprint race, sprint qualifying shouldn't be setting the grid for the Grand Prix. We did see something pretty exciting in Brazil, right? Like, we saw an entire interwoven storyline between qualifying and sprint qualifying in the race. Like
Mhm.
that was an exciting weekend that teased at the
Absolutely.
potential of what this could potentially be. But the other thing, and this kind of goes back to the story we were talking about a couple of minutes ago, which is this is exciting for F1 because one, it gets more eyeballs on the TV and on the streaming app for 3 days instead of two. But it also makes it easier for them to increase the sanctioning fee for those race weekends. So if I'm a race and I'm paying $25 million now, and Liberty gives me the opportunity to host one of these special sprint qualifying race weekends, hey, maybe now I'll pay $30 million because I'm going to get that many more people through the gate on the Friday when maybe there could just be some stragglers sitting in the stands watching free practice because they don't work weekdays. That's the real reason here is
Yeah,
increased revenue, which is
but then
fine.
you have like this real disparity in the race hosting fees, right? You look at Interlagos; they're on the calendar now till 25. They're paying $25 million per year for the race hosting fee. And last year they got the sprint race on top of it. Like you say, it had like that phenomenal backstory that was interwoven and then kind of drove the narrative right from the Thursday from when everybody just arrives at the track right up until the race itself started. But I mean, if you're one of these other tracks that's say Azerbaijan, for example, paying $55 million per
Yeah, great point.
year, and they're on the calendar to 24, so excuse me, roughly the same amount of time as Brazil. It's just like, well, we're paying double what these guys are, but they're getting this extra cherry on top. So you can see, excuse me, that where there might be some dispute among the different race events. Okay, moving along to Mercedes. James Allison, sorry, James Allison, who's the chief technical officer. What a great title that is, by the way. Believes that the changes that are being introduced this year dwarf any other changes that we've seen in Formula One, basically in history, which is absolutely a huge quote. So James had to say, quote, "I've been working in the sport for over 30 years and they dwarf anything else that I've ever seen. I suspect if I were to dig out Wikipedia and go through every single season of the sport that there's ever been, there would be nothing to match the scale of the change that comes with 2022. The rule set is not only enormous, the regulations about twice the size of what's preceded them, but they're almost entirely different of what came before them. And that has meant that we've had to reinvent the car tip to toe. Everywhere you look, it's completely new, not just new parts, but as in a completely new philosophy, a completely different aerodynamic package, different brakes, different wheels, crucially different tires, and even the engine. One of the things which is less touched by the regulations than many, even there, the power unit has to be prepared so it can be frozen for 3 years. All the goodness that you can possibly pack into it has been packed into it for now or forever hold your peace, because after that the changes will be very difficult to make real. It has been incredibly hard, end quote. So you have a guy like James Allison that's been around the sport for an incredibly long time come out and say that and basically break it down into that that little, well, it's not even a little quote, but I mean, you just get a sense of just what when I'm reading it, I'm just like, okay, what am I reading here? So you can imagine if you're working on this, and basically this car is new in every single aspect. I mean, even down to the size of the wheels that these cars are going to be using. It is really is incredible, and I think that's why there is so much attention focused on Formula One and this new season, is just because I think we all comprehend, regardless if you're the chief technical officer of Mercedes or just a couple of regular fans like you and I think we all understand how huge these changes are and how excited and also perhaps a little bit nervous these changes are going to work, and are they going to have the intended effects that they had all these years ago.
The quote that he had that struck with me the most was this one. The rule set is not only enormous, the regulations are about twice the size of what
I
preceded them,
know.
but they're almost entirely different. So when you think about that, what he's talking about is prior to this year, the formula, the regulations upon which teams would refer when they built their car, it was pretty loosely defined, which is why we see such huge variation in things of wing design and barge boards and side pods, that there was this wild variation because the regulations and the formulas were pretty loose, and it gave designers and engineers a ton of creative license. What he's saying here is no, now the regulations the regulations are twice as thick as they were before, which means that the designers and the engineers have far less creative license, which means in theory, the conclusions which they draw should be much more similar to each other. So in the past, you could have a team that looks at the formula and says, we're going to do this with our wing because we're allowed. And another team would say, hey, we're going to do something completely different because it's allowed. But the regulations now are so tight that the conclusions that those two individual teams come to on that one component should be very similar. And then on top of that, there's far more standardization in terms of the parts. So either, hey, you need to simply design your part to this exact standard. So all the teams
Mhm.
design and build the same part, or you all need to go to the same supplier and buy that part there. And we saw that with BBS being now the sole supplier of wheels. So teams don't have the ability to source or build their own wheels anymore. Every team is going to rock the exact same wheels wrapped in the exact same tires. And we'll eventually, I assume, get somewhere as well where they're using standardized braking components as well, probably from Brembo or a different supplier like that.
Yeah, kind of makes you wonder if that's the direction that the sports is going to go. And I kind of have the feeling like you do that
Yeah.
exactly what's going to happen. Okay, time for another break. When we come back, we still have a pile of things to talk about. So don't go away. We'll be back in just a moment. All right. Well, welcome back to the show. And next story up on the agenda is Saudi Arabia is going to alter the track layout for 2022. This race is coming up at the front end of the calendar compared to the back end of the calendar. I mean, it's only been a couple of months. When did we have Saudi? It was just back in November, wasn't it, Mark? I think it was.
No, December 5th.
Was it
December 5th,
December?
I
I was
think.
going to. Yeah, I thought it
Yeah.
was middle of November, but I've lost all concept of time. But yeah, so I mean, it's coming up pretty quick, and I think that was the impression that we all had. It seems like it's a track of a lot of potential, but it was just I think they overthought it a little bit, and it was obvious that some of the features and some of the corners that they built in the track of that initial configuration just was not conducive to those cars, and in some places was just downright dangerous. Anyways, the race CEO Martin Whitaker said that the work will be done to address the safety concerns and improve visibility before they have the next race there in March. Anyways, Whitaker had to say, quote, "We have been striving to improve on some areas for our second event. Firstly, there are going to be one or two slight changes to the track. These tweaks are directly related to the driver's sight line from the cockpit. It's minimal work, but it will help improve forward visibility in a couple of corners. Secondly, we will make some small modifications to the barriers that will favor the lines that the drivers take around the course." End quote. So those are the obvious ones. I mean, we had that restart when it required another restart where you had like this sort of a accordion effect of everybody driving up the backside, and there was just incidents all race long. So hopefully these what he's saying are minor tweaks will actually enhance the track and make it obviously safer, but will also lead to a better race. So we'll find out.
I
I mean, it's only going to be what 2 months now before we go back to Jeddah. So there's that.
definitely. We're lucky with Jeddah this year. It was exciting and it looked great on TV, but I'm very happy that they're receptive to the feedback from the drivers because the drivers were very clear that this felt very dangerous in places, and it was specifically because of the lack of visibility. And I think we know in Formula One that oftentimes
Yeah.
drivers initiate the movement of turning into a corner long before they can see the exit from that corner. But I think even at Jeddah, they felt a little bit unsafe, simply that there were too many blind corners where there could have been straights. But I'm very, very happy and relieved to hear they're listening to feedback from the drivers. I'm surprised that the changes are as subtle as they're described in this article and through those quotes, because I
Yeah,
assume that
tell
there
that to
would
the
have been
people that actually have to make these changes. It'll be yeah, yeah, minor tweaks. Yeah, thanks, Martin.
that's fair. That's fair. And again, the FIA did give their blessing on this track moments before the first Grand Prix, but you're right, the turnaround was remarkably quick too. We're talking about 3 or 4 months between
Yeah,
Grand Prix, and then ultimately this track could possibly be decommissioned in the near future as we move to Qadiyah anyways,
yeah.
but I'm glad they're being responsive to drivers because ultimately safety is paramount beyond anything.
Absolutely. And I mean, the thing is, too, I was going into that race. Carlos Sainz was one of the drivers. I think maybe even Gasly. They were if memory serves correctly, they were among the guys that were talking and voiced concerns about safety, and especially Gasly was, or sorry, Science was saying that if something happens, you're going to be on top of it before you can even really react.
Totally.
And he was proven correct in that regard. Fortunately, nobody was hurt, but when you see the amount of incidents that we have, I mean that potential is there, so they have to have it sorted out ASAP. Okay, next story. 2022, there's going to be a 3-day weekend schedule with the media activities moved to Friday. So things are going to be kind of compacted, condensed a little bit because we are going to embark on another mammoth season, 23 races. And obviously, over the past 2 years, as we've gone through the pandemic, that this has been kind of a fluid situation, and we've expected, especially in 2021, sorry, in 2020, that it was just a big question mark. And I mean, they did a phenomenal job to get 17 races in that year when everything was still so uncertain. And last year, I mean, still things were still tossed around, and we still ended up getting 22 races, which was phenomenal. But I feel like going into this year, despite all the things we hear about Omicron and cases and stuff like that, I have a feeling now we're starting to sort of settle into it. And I found that I'm kind of feeling that we're finding a way to go into, or, you know, do things properly, I guess is maybe the phrase I'm searching for within this pandemic, as hopefully it starts to burn itself out. That's, I feel more confident that this 23 race calendar is going to happen this year compared to the previous 2 years. I think,
Definitely.
somewhat
And we've heard the
awkwardly, that's what I'm
commitment.
trying to get to.
Yeah, I feel you. And I think we've started to hear that from as well. Australia, who certainly hasn't now hosted an event since 2019. The Australian
Mhm.
government's come out already and pledged their commitment to the fact that going to go ahead. And I think this is the year the world becomes that we're going to need to find a way to coexist and live with this virus. And I think we're probably going to see a 23 race calendar. Knock on knock on wood, fingers crossed, but I feel confident that that's what we're going to see. The other thing to just quickly add about this is when we talk about the 3-day race weekend, historically, to give everyone a little bit of context, typically the teams would roll in on the Wednesday, the mechanics would start putting the car together on the Thursday, the team leadership and the drivers would do all of their media obligations. On Friday, you would have 2 90-minute free practice sessions. On Saturday, you would have a 60-minute free practice session and then qualifying. Last year, I presume, spirit of cost considerations, they cut down those Friday free practice sessions to 60 minutes. I don't know if we talked about this last week, but it looks like they're going to stretch those Friday free practice sessions back to 90 minutes, but they're also going
Mhm.
to all of those media obligations into Friday. So what had historically been a 4-day race weekend is now a 3-day weekend. So I'm sure the mechanics will still be busy assembling the cars,
Sure.
get ready for Friday, but there won't be any media availability. There won't be anything like that. There won't be anything happening at the track. So in the past, where fans may have been able to buy that 4-day pass, I'm not sure that that's going to be a thing. And I think it's going to be a more compressed package. And the reason for this being that, hey, if we're going to have 23 races this year, if we can cut potentially one day off that race weekend for every race weekend, we can potentially give 23 days back to certain members of certain teams. That's
Mhm.
one less day they need to be at the track. That's one day more that they can spend at home, or one additional day they can spend at the factory.
Yeah, and I think they have to make concessions somewhere. I mean, if you're expecting, your teams to show up for 23 races in all four corners of the globe, you have to find some other way to give some time back to them. So, I mean, if they can condense a race weekend into 3 days from four, then I'm all for it. Okay, next story, and this is the one that just keeps evolving and changing all the time. So apparently, Honda is going to be a lot more involved in Formula One, because I swear a year ago they said that they're going to be leaving Formula One at the end of 2021, but then they said that they weren't quite going to, and now it's turning out that they're going to be a little bit more involved than the last time they said they were going to be a little bit more involved. And this comes, yeah, I know it's like trying to keep up, right? It gets a little bit difficult, but Helmut Marko, who's the big advisor over there at Red Bull, says now revealed that they found a different solution to things that they had originally sorted out or arranged with excuse me, with Honda. And now excuse me, it's panning out that the power units are still going to be manufactured exclusively and 100% in Japan, and so they don't need to worry about manufacturing the motors in England. This is still all going to be done in Japan. And the interesting thing is, and I guess this isn't really a surprise because it came out before Christmas, that even though Honda was moving everything over, and this whole Red Bull powertrains or whatever they're calling it was going to take over everything, that they weren't going to be able to actually take over the IP and use it to build their own engine in 2026 and beyond. So now that's been confirmed that IP is going to stay in Japan. It's going to stay with Honda, and so that really leaves a real clean slate with Red Bull and what's going to happen in 2026. So that makes that whole VW Audi slash Porsche story and situation a lot more interesting.
This is just bonkers when you think about it, that a year ago, well, probably a little more than a year ago, late 2020, Honda announced their departure from F1, that 2021 would be their last season. And like you said, the story keeps evolving and getting legs. And it was thought that, hey, Honda, as a professional courtesy to Red Bull, would supply engines in 2022, but ultimately they would hand over the IP to the current power unit, and that for 2023, 2024, 2025, Red Bull would use that IP, that blueprint, to develop the engines themselves. Well, all of a sudden, that's not what's happening here at all, and the story keeps evolving. So what we know now is that Honda, as expected, is going to supply power units, unbranded power units for 2022, but they're now going to provide the exact same power units out of their Japan facility for 23, 24, and 25. So Honda is now in this absolutely peculiar, bizarre situation where they are building and supplying power
Mhm.
units to a customer team, but they get none of the benefit of having the Honda badge on that engine or in the title sponsorship of that team. It's just the
It's
most
a
peculiar
bizarre.
situation.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it really comes down to, or at least it's been speculated, that the previous leadership team at Honda in Japan, in Tokyo, had decided to pull the plug, that this experiment wasn't what they thought it was going to be. It's not in line with their road car ambitions, but that the incoming leadership team was much more invested to doing it. But ultimately, they had inherited the decisions that were made before they got there. But
Mm.
now we're in this peculiar situation where, for all intents and purposes, they are the official supplier of the power units, but they're going to get none of the credit. Now, in the meantime, we know that Red Bull's been building up their powertrains division. So their team now no longer has to do anything for the current generation of power unit. They are totally hands off. They're going to be two separate operations. So you're going to have the Honda facility in Japan supplying power units up until 2026. In the meantime, the Red Bull powertrains division in Milton Keynes is going to start developing the future power unit that will supersede it. Now, to your point, the interesting thing is, will they do that themselves, or are they going to partner up with the Volkswagen Group and have them bring in their experts to help supplement their knowledge base? It's a very
Yeah.
peculiar situation, and I can't believe that Honda is willing to continue to supply engines without any of the ancillary benefits of being on that power unit from a stamp perspective. It's just bizarre.
Yeah, it's got to be some sort of almost like a marketing kind of thing now that they sort of committed to this sort of completely electrification of their road car fleet. Maybe they want to
Yeah,
be seen as hands off of anything with an
great
internal
point.
combustion unit, and perhaps, like you say, that the current leadership in Tokyo has just inherited this decision from the previous regime and has just decided to go with it for whatever reason. But yeah, I mean, it's a real head scratcher, and it's kind of funny too because the way that this story is kind of evolved, you can't really. I'm just surprised every time this little twist kind of like pops up every
Yeah.
several weeks. It's very very peculiar, like you say. But it's interesting because Masashi Yamamoto, who's the former Formula One managing director at Honda, is leaving the company to set up consultancy work firm to actually work with Red Bull. So just it's sort of twist upon turn, and all these different things. So I mean, you would think a person of Yamamoto's caliber and his experience, you wouldn't think he would walk away from a job with a company like Honda to set up a consultancy firm for something that's only just going to last. I mean, there's got to be some sort of long-term plan to this that we're obviously not privy to and we're not seeing. And but when you see all these things and hear all these things, especially Mr. Yamamoto moving on to do his own thing, kind of leaves a lot more questions that need to be answered that we currently have answered for ourselves. Okay, let's take a look. What's up next? Oh, this is okay. That's still the Honda one. Actually, let's take a final break, and then we've got a bunch of quick hits, which we'll get to, and then we'll slowly start to wrap up the show. So don't go away. We'll be back in just a short moment after a short message from our sponsors. All right, and welcome back. And Lando Norris, the McLaren driver, said he's happy and confident to be a pioneer for mental health in Formula One this season. And this past year, Norris had his own mental health issues and talked quite openly and candidly about those, and especially the excuse me, some of the struggles that he had in his rookie season back in 2019. Anyways, Lando had to say, quote, I think, first of all, I'm very happy to see more and more people speaking out about it and realizing it's only going to benefit them and benefit others. I don't think there's any negatives really from doing so. It's only going to help you get better, and it's only going to help if you're going to have a big following. If you have a lot of people watching or whatever it is, you're only going to get help from people who are also struggling. So first of all, I'm very happy. I'm proud to be part of that group of people who have accepted it and are happy and confident to speak out about it. And I think one of the biggest things which have allowed me or made me think that it's a good thing to speak out about is my fans, my followers. It's basically when I could hint at, for example, that the first few times before I was speaking about it publicly, a few of them saying it's helping them or the impact that it's had on them. And over time, raising the impact I can have on those thousands of people is huge, end quote. So good on Lando. I think it's great. Obviously, when it says something that he's experienced himself and he's using that platform and the influence that he has as a Formula One driver for something positive and for something good, especially something as important and crucial as mental health, I think it's a really, really good thing.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's not thousands, it's tens or hundreds of thousands of people or millions of
Exactly.
people. And this is less about the state of mental health within the Formula One ecosystem. This
Yeah.
is more just about destigmatizing mental health in general. And if you can
Sure.
have somebody like Lando Norris, who's a hero, a superhero to so many fans, and he can come out and talk about this, it destigmatizes it for all those people that maybe suffer from it, but they don't know they're suffering from it. Or furthermore, they know that something's wrong, but they wouldn't know where or how to ask for support. So it's just great to bring this into the public consciousness and talk about it, because if you destigmatize it, people that suffer from it that maybe wouldn't have been so open to seeking treatment are more likely to do so. Like, look, this guy who's a Formula One race car driver, this is a guy who's contending to win Grand Prix. He's on top of the world. He struggles with mental health. Maybe
Yeah.
I'm not so peculiar and unusual and weird and all those things that people that struggle with mental health sometimes self label with. But I just think it's cool, and the more we talk about it, the better, because ultimately, if it encourages people to seek treatment and get better, improve their quality of life, that's a good thing.
Absolutely. Next story moving along is the W Series has confirmed they're coming back for a third season. They're going to have 8 rounds that is going to kick off in Miami at the beginning of May. There's going to be 3 carryover events from last year. That's be Britain, Hungary, and Coda. So the tracks or the races that we're going to have in Miami, Barcelona, Silverstone, Le Castellet in France, Budapest, Suzuka, Coda, and then season finale roughly about Halloween at I was going to try and say the Spanish equivalent, but let's just go with Mexico City. I think it's
This is awesome.
Autodromo Hermanos Rodriguez. So there you go.
You're so well when it comes to speaking foreign dialects and getting dialects. Is that even an appropriate term? I don't know. But you're
If my
so
buddy
good at.
Jorge, who's from Mexico City, hears that, he's going to be, I'm going to get angry messages. It's like, he's like, dude, just stop. Don't try with the Spanish. He just butchered every time. But so
Well,
anyways,
you're great
I try.
Dutch. You are great with the Dutch. I will give you credit for that. But I'm super excited, and we owe our
Yeah.
fans I think, better when it comes to W Series coverage. And just to kind of state the calendar here real quick, it's going to open in Miami, which is super exciting because that event is going to get a ton of global exposure. And this is why I was so excited for season 2 of the W Series, when they basically piggybacked on the F1 calendar. And I don't mean that in a derogatory sense or a disrespectful sense, but I think it's good for any young racing series to be able to travel with F1 and
Sure.
get that level of exposure. But we're going to see them in Miami, which is super exciting. We're going to see them in Spain a couple of weeks later, then Silverstone
Mhm.
on July 1st to 3rd. We're going to go to France, Hungary, Japan, Austin, once again, where we saw 400,000 people experience W Series over the course of that race weekend, which is fantastic for the series. And then, like you said, the championship will wrap up in Mexico City, in Mexico at the end of October. So I'm super excited for the series. We're probably going to have a new champion, or we will potentially have a new champion this year based on the way that the grid's shaking up, which is also very cool. But I would love to see the W Series continue to evolve and improve these cars with time. I think the drivers are far more capable than the cars that they're driving. And I
Sure.
would
Yeah.
like to see that as the W Series evolves, we see more and more sophistication in the
Mhm.
packages that these drivers are being given.
Yeah, totally. Great to see them come back for another year. Next story. So we told this is kind of going back to what we were talking about much earlier in the show, but Singapore is back on the calendar this year. Going to be on the calendar now until 2028 after signing a new deal. Obviously, we haven't been to Singapore in a couple of years because of COVID and all that, but we're going to be back there October 2nd, the weekend of October 2nd this year. And that's going to be one of these triple header weekends, and it's going to be right in there with Russia and Japan. So good to be back. You know, I kind of have mixed feelings sometimes about road circuits, but for me, I don't know. Like sometimes I'm not really all that excited about Singapore, but every time we go to Singapore, I'm always excited to watch the race. I don't know what it is. Once we actually go there, I enjoy watching that race quite a bit. Maybe if you're not Sebastian Vettel and Kimi Raikkonen, who had kind of an embarrassing coming together there a couple of years ago, but that's another conversation for another day. Now, this might be one that you want to speak to a little bit. So, Williams Advanced Engineering has been sold off in a 164 million pound deal to an Australian firm called Fortescue Metals Group, which is a mind-boggling, it's a staggering amount. I mean, 164 million pounds. That is not a small amount of change at all. So, this Fortescue have bought 100% of the company, and the chairman, Dr. Andrew Forrest, says that the deal came about as his company looks to help, quote, save the planet from cooking, end quote. And by heading towards the ambitious aim of making FMG fully carbon neutral by 2030. So that's Fortescue Metals Group. So, what are your thoughts on this one, Mark? Did this seem
Yeah, I think that
inevitable that this might happen at some point?
Yeah, and I think we need to be very clear here that Williams Advanced Engineering and Williams Grand Prix Engineering are two distinct
Yeah.
entities. And it's not the Formula One team that's being sold here. It's a company that was created by Frank Williams. Back around 2010, I think, is when it was stood up. Yeah, Williams Advanced Engineering was founded by the late Sir Frank Williams back in 2010, born out of the Williams Formula One team with the aim of becoming leaders in engineering and technology sector. So it was stood up initially as an operation to help the team earn revenue. So Williams, being an independent family-owned business, could depend only on constructors' prize money and sponsorship money to fund the operation. So about 10 years ago, Frank had started to explore other sectors that, hey, we have these great engineering resources here under the roof at our factory. What if we started using them and monetizing them in
Mhm.
different ways? And ultimately, this group
Sure.
became hugely profitable and really the backbone of that operations, really the backbone of their financial operation being spun off. So I'm not necessarily clear on who has a stake in the ownership of Williams Advanced Engineering at this point, whether it's Dorilton, whether it's the Williams family, or a little bit of both. But ultimately, it's been gobbled up by this bigger Australian company to, as you explain, very much gear them towards the future of a lower carbon neutral existence. And Craig Wilson, Williams Advanced Engineering Chief Executive, explained high performance battery and electrification systems are at the core of what we do at WAE. And this acquisition investment will facilitate the company's future growth to support the delivery of zero emission products and services across existing sectors such as automotive, motorsport, and off highway, and
Mhm.
new sectors. Two, former Williams F1 deputy team principal Claire Williams also expressed her support for the deal, given the wider implications for trying to bring global emissions down. She added, and I quote, since the team sold a majority shareholding in WAE to EMK Capital a couple of years ago, EMK and the management team have done a fantastic job in taking the business forward. We are delighted that Fortescue are now taking over that mantle and see the value in the company, its people, and tackling some of the biggest issues facing our world today.
Cool. That's a neat story. Okay, next one. I'm going to let you take this one because I'm comfortable in talking about most things with four wheels, but two wheels is not. I'm not really quite as knowledgeable as you are. But let's talk a little bit about motocross,
I
specifically
am
Kawasaki.
So I'm shocked about this, and I still feel like when I saw this story earlier today that it was Kimi Räikkönen pranking all of us. But big news, and I think all of us speculated, believed, assumed that Kimi would disappear into the sunset. He would camp out with his family. He would
Mhm.
enjoy a quality brew every evening on the porch of his place, and that he would relax for the rest of his eternity. And that the last
Sure.
thing that he would ever become involved with again was motorsport. We all joked about that he would never be seen at an F1 track again. Well, we were all wrong because Kimi Räikkönen is getting right back into motorsports, and he is doing so through a motocross venture, which he claims is an extremely serious project. So, Kimi now is the team principal of the official Kawasaki Racing Motocross Grand Prix team, which is absolutely mind boggling because, again, like I said, I never expected to see him involved with professional organized motorsports again. But here he is,
Same.
a team principal. And I quote, it's no secret that for me, one of my greatest passions in life for many years has been motocross, but this team is not what you might call a hobby. It's very serious, says Kimi. I am very focused and we aspire to be the very best we possibly can be, he says. Now I've retired from racing. I will be able to spend more time on this project, not on the daily issues, but more from a strategic point of view, using my experience of how teams work and what creates success on the world stage. Including myself, is delighted that Kawasaki has chosen us to be their factory team. I know that the chances of success is always greater with direct factory support. So this translates into a great opportunity for us at the new Kawasaki racing team in MXGP. Wow. So I'd never expected to see him involved with organized racing again. Here he is 2 months later, a team principal for the official Kawasaki entrance in MXGP. Just incredible.
Yeah, totally. When I saw this earlier today, I did a double take. I wasn't sure. Well, the first thing I did is I want to make sure that it wasn't April 1st because
Yeah, me
much
too.
like
That's what I
yourself,
kept
that
thinking.
yeah, I totally did not expect to see Kimmy come back, but good for him. And whether or not this grows into something else, and or he sticks with this, or this is just kind of a one-off, remains to be seen. But certainly not one of the news items I was expecting to see this week or at all. Period. Okay, final story, and this is a cool one. So Tatiana Calderon, 28-year-old Colombian driver, will be driving for AJ Foyt Racing next year in the NTT IndyCar Series, driving the number 11 Rocket Chevrolet. So this is pretty cool. I mean, she's kind of been, excuse me, on the fringes of Formula One over the past, couple of years here and there. You want to talk about this one a little bit more, Mark?
Yeah, I think this is an exciting story, and it's really the first time we've had a potential permanent female fixture on the IndyCar scene. Obviously, since
Mm,
Danica Patrick was around, I think
sure.
she's an incredibly talented driver with significant amounts of experience. I don't believe for a second that this is a IndyCar marketing exercise. I think that series is too well established. I think it's too professional. I think she's going to be a very capable.
I agree.
It just gives me another reason to tune into Indy this year. And it's not that I need it anymore because I thought last year's championship was fantastic. I love
Hmm.
the amount of excitement around IndyCar right now. They're going to some great places that have been incredibly receptive to having them. Nashville was a perfect example last year. That was super fun. Long Beach, which has been a long time established race on the calendar, looks
Yep.
like it was an absolutely huge blast of a race. I think this championship is in really great place. And I've said this before, but Formula One Liberty, if they really want to find a way to grow their revenues, they need to find a way to buy IndyCar and bring it
Hmm.
under their portfolio of open wheel racing championships. I think there would be some great symmetry for both championships. But I think this is a great pickup for that team. And I'm excited to see what she can do on the track next season. I'm hoping and I expect that she'll be quite successful. And I think this
Yeah.
is just great for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And for somebody that's like a bit of a casual IndyCar fan, I just can't help but to feel over the last couple of years that this series is kind of really stabilized, is kind of
A
having
hundred
a bit of a,
percent agree.
a renaissance, and then kind of really starting to percolate up through the sporting consciousness. I mean, I found myself last year tuning into IndyCar races a lot more than I had previously.
Same.
Number one, because it was a little
100%.
bit easier to find than it was previous to that. So it's really good. I mean, and there's a lot of former Formula One drivers in IndyCar. Not that's a reason to tune in or that legitimizes the series itself, but it's pretty cool. I mean, and it just kind of goes back to that sort of evergreen conversation that regardless who you are, I mean, good drivers are good drivers, and hopefully that they all get a shot somewhere to display their talents, because ultimately, we as the fans benefit the most when you have the best drivers, regardless of gender, race, age, whatever, get into a racing car, and it just lends to the spectacle. So let's hope we see more of this, and best of luck to Tatiana and IndyCar this year. And that's about it. I don't have anything else. I think that we've worked our way nicely through our schedule. So thank you all again, one and all, for joining us and hanging out. Especially extra shout out to those of you in the live stream on YouTube tonight. And if you want to get in touch, by all means, do so. Send us a tweet at Scuderia F1 Pod on the Twitters, or send me an email now that our inbox is spam free, at least until the morning. And you can do so at scuderiaf1pod at gmail.com. And that's it. And on behalf of myself and Mr. Mark Hamilton, thanks very much for listening. Have a great weekend.